Neden tüm insanlar eşit haklar ve değerlere sahiptir?
There are two facts about the world we live in that provide strong evidence that the universe was created by a personal God. The existence of absolute moral value and the existence of consciousness. Now, let's begin with the first. Everyone knows that there are some things that are right and some things that are wrong. People who claim to be relativists, that whatever's right and wrong is relative to my perspective and there's nothing true for everyone, really don't believe that. Because if you find out something they care about very deeply, like protecting the environment or racism, and if you treat it as though it were nothing but opinion or it's just relative, that you don't have to care about those things, then they get very angry and frustrated because they think you ought to care about the environment and you ought to care about racial injustice and things of that sort. So when it comes to the things that people care deeply about, they are absolutists. They believe that there are true moral principles that apply to everyone. They're only relativists in the areas of their life where it's convenient to them. Maybe their sexual morality, because they want to be promiscuous. So everyone really knows deep down that there are things that are just right and things that are wrong. The torturing little babies for the fun of it is wrong. And so if someone can't recognize that, they don't need an argument, they need counseling. So the question really is, how could there be such a thing as an objective moral law? Where did it come from? And the difficulty for the atheist is that the atheist in these days believes that the only thing that's real is what the hard sciences tell us is real, so that physics and chemistry tell us that the physical world is all there is, and everything inside the physical world is entirely physical. And they claim the backing of science for that assertion. So the problem is, though, that these people still recognize that there are some objective duties and objective laws that we discover to be true. We don't invent them. So now the problem is that if your worldview says in the beginning were the particles, you have a big bang, and from that point on, you have nothing but matter that rearranges according to the laws of chemistry and physics into different structural groupings of these particles. So you get galaxies and planets, and you get the Earth, and you get the evolution of life, but life is purely physical, and evolution is a purely physical process. So that if you start with matter, and all you do is rearrange it, all you're going to get is rearranged matter. You're not going to get something brand new popping into existence by just rearranging matter. Because you see, consciousness consists in states like sensations, like a taste of a lemon, or thoughts, or beliefs, or a desire, say a desire for a certain food, or intentional acts of free will. These are all conscious states. And conscious states have resisted being reduced to brain states. Brain states can be correlated with conscious states, but they're very, very different. Consciousness has features that are true of it that are not true of any matter. For example, there is a what it's like to every conscious state we have. There's a what it's like to feel pain. There's a what it's like to taste a strawberry. And those are different. There is no what it's like to be an electron, and there's no what it's like to be a chunk of mass, and there's no what it's like to be a brain. So brains are entirely physical, but consciousness has features that physical states don't. So consciousness is clearly immaterial, spiritual, non-physical. And so you see, the problem is that if you begin with matter, and the history of the world is the rearrangement of matter according to the laws of chemistry and physics, physics tells us that matter does not contain even the potential for consciousness. It is what's called brute matter. And by brute matter, that means that it is entirely describable by chemistry and physics without remainder. So that means there's no potentiality for consciousness to appear. But consciousness exists. We all know that. You can't convince me that I'm not conscious. And since consciousness is not physical, you could not explain the origin of consciousness from a beginning universe that's purely material, as most atheists today, at least in the Western world, use to justify their atheism. Well, science tells us everything. We don't need God. But if you begin with, in the beginning was God, if your fundamental being is not a particle, but it is a conscious being himself, then your fundamental reality already has consciousness. Whereas for the atheist, their fundamental reality has no consciousness whatsoever. So it is easy for the theist to explain how consciousness could appear later on in the universe, because if God is himself conscious, it would be very easy for him to cause another being that shares an attribute that he has, because it already exists. And the same is true of the moral law, because the moral law attributes to beings like you and me that we have what's called intrinsic value. We have value in and of ourselves. We're not just means to an end. We have inherent value. Friendship has inherent value. It's a good thing. Keeping your promises is right to do. Not murdering or stealing what does not belong to you is just wrong. These things have the properties of being right or wrong, or having the property of inherent worth or value. But you see, the problem is, if you begin with matter, where is the property of being inherently valuable going to come from? Because if you look at the way physics describes matter, they might list it as having the following properties. It's solid. It has a certain rest mass. It might have a negative or positive charge. It may have electromagnetic properties. It can move through space or be stationary. But you will never see in a physics or chemistry textbook that the fundamental particles or the objects of matter have the property of intrinsic value or worth. And so the theist does not have that problem, because their fundamental reality is not only conscious, but he is an inherently good, valuable being. In fact, the most valuable being that could possibly exist. And so if God himself has intrinsic value and has consciousness, he could create other beings like humans that have intrinsic value and that are conscious. There is another problem that the atheist must face, and that is that when we discover the moral law, it presents itself to us as a set of extremely weighty or important commandments, like don't murder, don't kill little babies, don't steal, things like that, don't commit adultery. Now, these are not like customs. The custom is in our country is don't eat peas with a fork, or with a knife rather, or a custom might be you should wear a certain kind of clothes to a certain meeting and not wear blue jeans, let's say. Well, those are customs, and if you violate a custom, if you're having dinner with people and you try to eat your peas with a knife, people are going to think you're being sort of rude, maybe, but nobody's going to think that you're an immoral person, because customs aren't that weighty. They're not that weighty. Now compare that with being at dinner with people and deciding to stick a knife in the ear of the person sitting next to you. Nobody's going to think you're just being maybe impolite. No, they're going to say what you did was wrong. You violated some commandment that tells you should not do that. But now I ask you, what kind of a being can impose duties on other beings and can legislate commands or imperatives? It cannot be the law of karma. It can't be impersonal matter, because laws come from conscious personal beings who have will, and therefore they can impose duties like the head of the government or someone like that on citizens. So we learn that where laws come from, because they have a command force behind them, and they're therefore imposed on others as commands or duties by a being, a person who has the power of will to command things. But now we discover that there is an objective moral law that is not just a human invention. The problem then is that this moral law cannot just exist on its own without there being a lawgiver. Because if there is an objective moral law that is not a human invention and we discover it, there has to be a lawgiver that is good, who commands these laws, and we should obey them because they come from the commands of a good moral lawgiver. And the lawgiver is what gives the objective moral law its force of command and its imposition of duties. And so the most reasonable explanation for how there could be a discovery of an objective moral law that applies to all of us, that has the force of command and duty, would be that there is an objective moral lawgiver that is inherently good. He has a good character, and he is the one who gave and imposed the objective moral law on human beings all over the world. And this law gives evidence that it did not come from a cloud of proton gas or particles, but it came from a good moral lawgiver. And so these are some of the reasons. There are others, but just to summarize now, how can you explain the origin of the property of intrinsic value that certain things and acts have? How can you explain the origin of sensations and thoughts and beliefs, conscious states? How can you explain the fact that we discover the objective moral law to come to us not as suggestions, but as commands that impose duties on us? The atheist actually has no reasonable explanation for these things. So their best view is to try to deny there is such a thing as consciousness, or to become moral relativists of some sort or another. But we all know that consciousness is real, and everyone, even those who claim to be moral relativists, know that there's an objective moral law. And they act according to it and expect you to act according to it. And so these facts about the universe we live in cannot be explained by the scientific atheist. They can only be explained most reasonably if there is a God who is himself good, who has the power of will, and is a conscious being. As I tried to weave this argument into my moral argument, but the problem is, again, that we know consciousness is not physical. And as I said, things like a sensation of pain, or a certain smell, or a thought that snow is white, a belief that 2 and 2 is 4, or a desire for ice cream, or an act of will. These are all conscious states. They're non-physical. They're immaterial. And where in the world could they come from? They can't come from matter, because matter doesn't have any consciousness in it. The scientists tell us that matter is what is called brute stuff. It's just pure immaterial stuff that does not even contain the potential for consciousness to appear. But yet consciousness is true of beings. I think animals have consciousness. Certainly we humans have consciousness. But you can't explain its origin from matter. But you can explain its origin from a being who is himself conscious, because you already have consciousness to work with in explaining finite consciousness. And so if you have a supreme being who is himself a conscious being, the idea that there could be in the history of the universe finite beings who were endowed with consciousness were not having to get something from nothing. Like the atheist has to get consciousness from things that don't have it. That's getting something out of pure nothing. And that's impossible. But not the theist. What we already have is consciousness. It is just now endowed. God takes consciousness and imbues it or endows it with certain creatures that he makes. That's not getting something from nothing. That is sharing and bringing about what he already has in other beings, admittedly to a finite degree, but it's still consciousness. So that's the argument from consciousness.